Welcome to Holy Smoke, the Spectator's religion podcast. I'm Damian Thompson. My guest today is Britain's most charismatic advertising guru, whose pithy observations of patterns of human behaviour have earned him a cult following across the industry, on TikTok, and among Spectator readers. It is, of course, Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman of the Ogilvy and Mather Group, and author of the Spectator's must-read Wiki Man column. Rory, whose wife is an Anglican priest, has the same capacity to enlighten and surprise us when he talks about religion as he does when he's eviscerating an ad campaign or revealing our secret shopping habits. Rory, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here and a wonderful joy to meet. Thank you.
I was scrolling through TikTok, I must be honest, very taken by you managing to convey the message in 1.5 minutes that religious societies can enjoy a competitive advantage over non-religious societies. I wonder if you could unpack that, as they say, for us.
I mean, I don't think it's right to justify religion purely on the basis of what you might call, empirical results. However, I remember talking to the evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers, who in many ways was the kind of precursor of many of Richard Dawkins' ideas. And I simply asked him the question, if you're a genuine scientist, you believe in experimentation. In other words, it doesn't matter how elegant your theory is. If the results don't match the theory, then you have to reject the theory. And I simply asked him the question, if you had 2 islands with equal resources and you populated one island with 50 evolutionary biologists for that matter, and the other island was populated with 50 Mormons, which society do you think would be flourishing more in 5, 10, 15 years' time? And he simply replied, my money's on the Mormons.
My money would be 2, I have to
Yes.
say. I mean, how many Mormons ended up being professors at Harvard Business School? A great many, as far as I remember.
By the way, I think any island populated by academics would be a catastrophe because they'd very, very rapidly get into extraordinary kind of what you might call vociferous tendencies over minor ideological differences. And therefore, any hope of useful cooperation would disappear almost immediately.
Yeah, and I think they'd also die out because nobody would want to sleep with them, whereas Mormons are famously good-looking.
Yeah, or else they'd get involved in some sort of incredible sort of woke battle over terminology or something of that kind. It always amuses me, by the way, that there are people I know in academia who won't speak to other people in academia because of some minor disagreement over methodology or whatever. And I always say, look, if you were both in business, you'd go into business together because you're close enough in terms of what you believe to form a working partnership in a commercial sense, but in an academic sense, they become absolutely the best of enemies.
Isn't it the narcissism of small differences? I mean, don't you find in your industry that disagreements over tiny points, let's say in an ad campaign, in a slogan, can result in nasty rows and, bigger arguments over what people should be selling?
Yes, I mean, the Freud's, the narcissism of small differences, I think, is genuinely one of Freud's better ideas, if we're being honest about it. And you can, of course, see that in Protestantism. There's a wonderful comedy sketch by the comedian Emo Phillips, where he meets someone who's about to jump off a bridge. And seeking to find something in common, he says, well, what are you, Catholic, Protestant? The chap says he's Protestant, Are you Baptist, Methodist, And they're both Baptists. It's all wonderful. First church of so-and-so or second church of so-and-so. And they establish more and more in common until finally the chap admits that he actually sits in the right-hand pews, not the left-hand pews, at which point Emo Phillips shouts, "Die, heretic," and pushes him off the bridge.
I'll be honest, I've heard a version of it in which it's Lutheran Missouri Synod or Westminster Synod or whatever. Die, heretic!
And even Quakers, of course, who you would think would be entirely easygoing, seem to have split into various different factions.
All religious groups split into different factions. It's one of the very few laws of social science when it comes to religion. I wanted to ask you quickly about Protestantism, the Protestant work ethic, because as you well know, Max Weber believed that modern industrial capitalism was pioneered by Protestants, specifically Calvinists, especially American Puritans, who believed that ritual piety and good works were completely irrelevant to their salvation, either they were saved or not, and therefore they devoted much of their time and energy to the efficient pursuit of material prosperity, which they did with tremendous effectiveness, rationalization, ruthlessness. And this ruthless attitude persisted even after the religious beliefs had evaporated. So Weber was convinced that the Protestant ethic really had fueled the Western model of industrial capitalism.
So Deirdre McCloskey writes quite a lot about bourgeois values, and she believes it's kind of Victorian cultural development. You could also say, by the way, that one, because Protestantism frowned on display or extravagant display, I think Adam Smith makes this observation. There were people in the United States who were in fact very wealthy, but incapable of displaying or advertising that wealth. And therefore, the only thing they could do with money was to reinvest it, because to enjoy it would be seen as sinful.
That is actually Max Weber's argument. I think he's building on Adam Smith, but that was Max Weber's argument. And the other point that Weber made, sometimes Protestants boast about the Protestant work ethic. It's actually not very flattering towards Protestants, because Weber's arguing that Protestants were so assured of their own salvation that they weren't very interested in the welfare of other people, and therefore felt entitled to pursue the most ruthless capitalist means possible. But I wanted to
there's an interesting psychological argument, I think, about Calvinism, which is, if I'm right about Calvinism, your salvation is preordained. And therefore, the reason you live a good life is not to secure salvation, but to convince yourself of its likelihood, if I'm right.
Absolutely right. And living a good life is a sign that you are one of the elect. And indeed, material success and prosperity is probably a sign that God is smiling on you. And why would God smile on you? Because you are one of the elect. In the end, you might ask, how different is this really from earning your salvation? But nonetheless, it was Weber's explanation for the particular competitive advantage that American capitalism had over the rest of the world, particularly Catholic Southern Europe. Now, you have made the point yourself that America was not so much founded by people escaping persecution as by vigorous fundamentalist persecuting nut job.
It was, when you think about it, from the UK perspective, the United States was not a shining city on a hill. It was actually a dumping ground for Puritan whack jobs, effectively. I think we ought to actually also give a bit of credit to Quakers here, because in terms of their numbers, they're probably the most economically successful group. Indian Jains are an interesting parallel, but in terms of purely the economic effects of a religion, Quakerism seems to be spectacularly effective. Now, some people attribute that to the fact that they couldn't go to Oxford or Cambridge, so the brightest people were forced to go into business because they were denied conventional means of sort of advancement. But also, two other factors would be, one, again, the resistance to display of wealth, and of course, the extraordinary fact that you didn't really need lawyers because your word had the force of a bond. And so Quaker business deals would have been extraordinarily straightforward, extraordinarily low friction events. It would probably typically involve one person buying another person's chocolate.
Cadbury was a Quaker,
Yeah.
and Cadbury try out the experiment of pubs that served nothing but hot chocolate.
So a large part of that chocolate thing was the idea that it was harm reduction. In fact, if you gave poorer people a source of entertainment that was non-alcoholic, then you could effectively switch them from beer consumption or gin consumption to chocolate consumption. And this was the less harmful thing to do. So I think Terry's, Rowntree's and Cadbury's are all Quaker foundations. I've got a vague idea. Bethlehem Steel is a Quaker foundation. One of the founders of Sony, unusually, was a Japanese Quaker. And you can, if you make the list, several of the banks, I think Lloyd's and Barclays, both had extensive Quaker influence at the beginning. And it's very, very interesting in a sense because it was business with a sense of social purpose. So we can get very, very snarky about this idea of, business having this high-minded social purpose. But very successful Quaker enterprises started with that motivation, which made them incredibly trustworthy, of course. So even if you weren't a Quaker, you were very content to do business with a Quaker business because, of course, even if you weren't telling the truth, you knew that they were. So I genuinely think for the numbers involved, it's the most remarkable thing, and we tend to think of modern Quakers as peaceniks going around in sandals, and some of them are quite rightly, by the way. But it was also in terms of the value to the economy. We should have encouraged more widespread adoption, I think.
And I think after the Quakers, because now I think Quakerism is probably a religion. It's become very politicized now, non-dogmatic in that it's not really technically Christian anymore. You can believe anything you like. But the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has had an astonishing record in the American marketplace. I mean, as I think I mentioned before, a large number of professors at Harvard Business School have been Mormons, successful Mormon politicians, Mormon entrepreneurs. And I think if you look at the Mormon story, it's not surprising that there's been, if you like, a sort of evolution, a survival of the fittest, because you had to be very fit indeed to make your way to Salt Lake City. And the enormous discipline that people had to impose on their lives, the strictness of the religion, I suppose, lent itself to a certain strictness of behavior, which is actually not that different from Max Weber's Protestant work ethic. But I'm wondering, I want to ask you about the situation now and the mainstream churches, because the mainstream churches have, understandably, I suppose, an ambivalent attitude towards capitalism. What they don't seem to be able to do is, whatever their attitude towards capitalism, to learn its tricks particularly well. And I'm wondering if you, as an advertising man, have ever been struck by an ad campaign, a successful ad campaign run by a mainstream church. The only one I can think of was run years ago by the Anglican Church in America. And it said, it was a picture of Henry VIII, and it said, "In a church founded by a man with 6 wives, forgiveness goes without saying," which I thought was quite snappy. But generally speaking, I think mainstream churches are not very good at selling themselves or their message.
There is a wonderful piece you can find online, which is the comedian Robin Williams explaining why he's an Anglican or an Episcopalian, I guess, which is an extraordinary piece, actually, as a kind of, obviously it's not a conventional ad, but it's a wonderful piece of writing where he explains himself that way. You're absolutely right. I mean, okay, I've joked about this. Apologies if you've heard this before, but I always say if my wife ever complains about me working in advertising or marketing, I simply reply, no one would have heard of Jesus if it wasn't for St. Paul. And I've always secretly imagined, with no documentary evidence, I ought to point out, that they always describe Paul as a tent maker. Now, my hunch is he was actually an estate agent. Okay, he was probably a tent salesman, never mind the width, feel the quality, lovely location. And it was, of course, an extraordinary piece. And this is very common, that you have a business partnership. I don't want to refer to it as such. Rolls and Royce. I mean, in the Rolls-Royce factory, the cars were called Royces because they venerated Royce as the engineer, and Rolls was the upper class sales guy who effectively knew how to sell to the rich clientele.
And there's this partnership thing. I mean, think of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young.
Perfect. And, you've got Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was the technologist. I mean, Jobs was a salesman, really. I mean, that's unfair. I mean, he was much more than that.
Well, what's interesting is that Jobs inspired religious devotion. And when he died, the scenes of mourning...
Yes, absolutely right.
Were very much like that of the death of a cult leader. And Apple faced the same dilemma as so many religious movements, arguably the one that Christianity faced and that Paul helped them deal with. What do you do after the death of the prophet?
That's fascinating. That's a brilliant parallel, actually. I'd never thought of it like that. And also, will we see Apple split up or get riven with various factions? You're already seeing, by the way, the AI world is becoming riven with, factions, including doomsayers and evangelists and every possible mix in between. But the death of the prophet is, you're right, the absolutely defining moment, which creates enormous problems.
Do you remember the old argument by Umberto Eco? It's 25, 30 years old, but Umberto Eco wrote an essay arguing that Apple was Catholic and Microsoft was Protestant, because at the time Microsoft made you do the work, the coding work yourself, and Apple gave you icons that mediated, if you like. Actually, there were priests, as it were, doing the work for you, like sacraments.
The modern analogy would be that Android as an ecosystem is Protestant. In other words, there are you can open it up, you can tinker under the bonnet. There are different cuisines and flavors of Android available. Whereas you're right that Apple appeals to people who like top-down consistency, where things are effectively delivered from above.
Yes, that's me.
And funnily enough, I'm both a Protestant and an Android user, because I always regard the Apple ecosystem. This puts me. I always tease the Spectators that I was at the carol service and I said I had to turn up as one of the few Protestants on the staff because it was actually at St. Bride's Church, and that there is that business where I always feel that once you sign up, it's a bit Apple's too cult-like for me. In other words, you sign up, in some ways it's very attractive because it provides you with the answer to everything, but at the same time it's what people often describe as a fur-lined trap, that once you're in, effectively it's inescapable and you have no room for individual expression or autonomy.
But let me ask you about the expression of people's personalities through the purchase of consumer goods. I mean, something I would say about successful churches and cults is that they tend to have very well-stocked gift shops. There's a diet book for every religious traditional fad you care to name, and I suppose lifestyle is the umbrella covering both sacred and secular. Do you think people's spiritual choices are very different from their consumer choices? After all, it's often said that we live in a spiritual marketplace, and you do have the ability through which books you buy, which churches you attend. You're not tied to a particular church or parish. You can customize your cosmology. And so it's not an accident that people talk about they go shopping around for churches or for religious beliefs.
I mean, it's very interesting because obviously, as we were saying, there's always this element of display involved in religion, and you often may have and generally, I suppose, one thing about religion is you could argue it's a way of signaling conscientiousness, and that successful religions make observance difficult enough that they are effectively, just as a luxury good is only attainable by a certain percentage of people, and an elite education at an Ivy League university, the numbers are deliberately kept scarce so that it retains its signaling value. I mean, there is an argument about the high intelligence of Ashkenazi Jews, which is simply that over 5, 6, 7, 8 centuries in Europe, the ones who are less intelligent effectively dropped out of the religion because it was too difficult. In a religion which absolutely prized scholarship and memorizing the Torah and reading endlessly, to be honest, if you were someone with an IQ of 97 in that environment, you thought, sod this for a game of soldiers. There's no way I can do this well here. I'll marry a girl called Marta with high cheekbones, go to the Catholic Church and enjoy bacon sandwich.
And I suppose it was different in the sense that rabbinical Judaism really required every adult male to study Torah or the Talmud, to apply themselves to intellectual tasks in a way that, the medieval Catholic Church had its scholars, but they were very much set apart. You decided to become
and it was
a
a mass, Christianity is undoubtedly, it's an acquisition-based religion rather than the retention-based religion. So it has a different marketing strategy.
Although Max Weber argued that the rationality of Judaism, particularly the Judaism of the prophets, which stripped away much of the magic of earlier religions, and actually some of the magic of early Judaism, was actually an important element in the development of rationalization in the West. He thinks it was borrowed by Christianity, particularly by St. Paul, and then found its way into Protestantism. Of course, Weber was very Protestant-centric, even though he wasn't a strong religious believer. I've got one last question, or one little story I have to tell you, because having read your Wiki entry, I noticed that one of your accounts, as it says, you worked for Dove Soap. Although I always thought Dove was a cleansing bar and not a soap. It describes itself as a cleansing bar.
Everybody calls it soap. It is chemically unrelated to what we think of as soap. And it was developed, the bar, during the Korean War to treat burns victims, because it was something like a non-astringent moisturizing version of soap, which would cleanse the wounds of people who'd been badly burned in Korea. And so actually David Ogilvy wrote the line, "Dove doesn't dry your skin like soap can," because it contains a quarter moisturizing agents and so on. So you're absolutely right. It is a cleansing bar.
You might wonder why. The reason I'm bringing it up is that years ago, I was doing a PhD. It was about conspiracy beliefs in the Pentecostal church. And at the time, one of the biggest conspiracy beliefs in the cultic milieu, as we called it, was the idea that Procter and Gamble's logo revealed that the company was secretly run by Satanists. And in fact, this urban myth became so widespread that Procter and Gamble actually had to employ somebody full-time to deny that the logo contained the mark of the beast.
We may, by the way, get a letter from their legal department if this podcast goes out.
They changed the logo years later. This was back in the 80s. They had a big problem with it.
It was a logo with, I think, 7 stars, wasn't it?
That's right. Anyway, they changed the logo, but there was a time when their legal department were very... Anyway, the point is, this urban myth was floating around, and this was a church in which there was a sort of conspiratorial subculture, one which the leadership of the church was actually trying to suppress because it was a cause of instability in the church. But nonetheless, it was floating around. So I was very keen to talk to people who believed in that sort of thing. And I found a lady who absolutely bought the Procter and Gamble thing. She said one of their executives revealed on a late night talk show that they were run by the devil, which I would have thought would be a dangerous thing to do, however late night it went out. So it was run by Satanists. So I said to her, well, how has this affected your shopping habits? And she looked slightly embarrassed, and she said, well, I try to be careful. I said, so you avoid Procter and Gamble products? She said, yes, I won't buy Dove, for example. And I had to tell her, it's not actually made by Procter and Gamble.
Never has been.
Never has been. But I thought that was an interesting... It just showed how people's conspiracy beliefs don't necessarily transfer into...
No. I mean, people's stated beliefs translate very badly into action. I mean, and actually that's, one interesting thing possibly about Protestantism, which is that... I mean, there's a whole thing about religion, which is totem poles work because they have eyes on them, and we behave fundamentally differently if we believe we're being watched. So the idea is that the totem pole in the middle of the tribal village was there to be an all-seeing deity so that people wouldn't get up to anything surreptitious when they were unobserved, because this totem was observing them all the time. And that goes back to sort of Plato and Gyges and the ring and everything else. But I mean, there have been modern behavioral science experiments where you put eyes over an honesty jar and you seem to get more people paying for their coffee simply because of the perception they're being watched. But equally, I mean, I've noticed, it's very amusing, in the electric car business, there is absolutely no correlation between people's commitment to the environment and their likelihood to buy an electric car.
And why is that?
To be honest, I mean, it's worth mentioning that new electric cars are quite expensive unless you're on some sort of salary sacrifice deal. But essentially, I think electric cars are bought for really reasons of novelty, performance, technology, excitement, or sometimes to avoid tax. Which raises, of course, a really interesting question in religious terms, which is it okay if people do the right thing for the wrong reasons?
Well, on subject of electric cars, the only I experience them most often in a cab, because cab drivers have to drive them. I have to say, I have yet to meet a cab driver bang on about the environmental advantages.
No, But actually, interestingly, what is quite interesting, because I actually use it to influence my decision, the cab drivers who've gone electric always say they'd never go back. Now, given that they drive professionally all the time, we should at least give them some heed, because if generally cab drivers will complain about everything, but I've never had a cab driver complain about their electric cab. Now, I'm sure there are some, there always will be. But it's quite interesting in a way that actually there's an empirical bit of evidence there that when forced to do it, the fact that they don't complain about it, and in many cases they would be free to go back.
I think that's an eco-sensitive message that puts to shame any Christmas statement by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Not that we have one at the moment, but we will have very soon. By the way, what do you make Christmas shopping?
Yes, okay, consumerism at Christmas, which disgusts me, by the way, and I work in advertising. However, I think the blame is misattributed. Because the reason we get these absurd profusions of present giving, some of the things I regard as repellent, like a whole family buy matching pajamas that they wear all day on Christmas Day and then never wear ever again. I regard that as pretty yuck. But then I guess I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and certain forms of extravagance still, fill me with horror because of the decade in which I grew up and the norms which I acquired then. But most of this is not because people are spending more. It's because consumer capitalism is so unbelievably successful at producing goods of reasonably high quality for insanely low prices. In fact, the proportion of our disposable incomes that we spend on consumption are continually going down, with most of the slack being taken up really by the property market.
That's interesting, because would you think so to walk through a shopping mall? Would you think that? Would you think that to walk through Westfield? Or could it be actually, I was talking to a friend of mine about Oxford Street, who was a friend from another country, who was saying Oxford Street is absolutely impossible on Saturdays. And I said, you should have seen it in the 90s. It was worse.
That's probably true. I mean, what is interesting to me is we blame consumers for consumerism, but in fact, I mean, just to give an example, in the 1950s in the United States, if you added up the value of someone's bought possessions, car, oven, television, music center, and so forth, the sum total of what they'd paid for the stuff they owned, clothes, furniture, would be about equivalent to what they paid for their house. Now, it would be a tiny fraction typically of what they paid for their house, unless you collect art or jewelry or something insane. Generally, it would be very difficult to find anybody whose possessions had a similar, in other words, you'd have to live in a £100,000 house and have possessions worth £120,000. That was the norm in the 1950s and early 60s in the United States. It would be completely unknown now because housing has gone up and up and up in price. And actually the cost of electronic G-jaws and gizmos and everything else has just gone down and down and down. So consumers aren't necessarily consuming more. It's simply that those things we buy at Christmas have become cheaper. When my parents bought a school uniform for me in 1977, it would have been, that was a significant amount of money. By which I mean, it was several £100s, and that was in 1977 to kit someone out for school. Now, it would cost actually less than that never mind real terms, it would cost less than that in absolute terms to kit a child out for school now, unless you're getting anything tailor-made or something. And so one of the things that it annoys Elizabeth Warren as well is that a lot of working class people are blamed for their poverty on the fact that they have a lot of stuff which the previous generation wouldn't have had. But that isn't what's contributing to their poverty. What's contributing to their poverty is actually, in the US, it's healthcare costs, housing costs, education costs to some extent, because not only do you pay for further education in many cases, but you have to move to a school district, which further adds to your property expense. And so Elizabeth Warren is very, very keen to dispel this idea that, poor people are poor because they spend too much money on flat screen TVs. In fact, flat screen TVs are vastly cheaper than a large TV would have been, or any television would have been actually in the 1960s. And so So the fact that people get into financial difficulty is often blamed on profligacy, and it's actually unfair. I mean, it's fundamentally unfair because food has got basically better and cheaper. Energy probably quite a lot cheaper, although it doesn't feel like it. But it's actually housing that's become monstrous. And so her argument is most of the gains of the double income household didn't accrue to the household. They actually accrued to property owners, to some extent the Inland Revenue, who now had twice as many people to tax, people providing childcare, and principally to the housing market. And so the typical family, this is a very interesting question for a religious point of view, the typical family lost 40 hours of discretionary time and with for no real increase in discretionary income.
And the loss of time is very important. I mean, the loss of time surely has a really significant effect on people's psyches and on people's spirituality. I would have thought that this is, the acceleration of time, the cost of living, the combination of ever ever accelerating expectations and anxiety. These are things that the churches should be able to address with their message, but I'm not sure that they can, because it's as if they are still addressing the sort of materialist dilemmas of 30 or 40 years ago.
I think that's probably true that the loss of time and what you might call mental space has been to some extent catastrophic. If you think of it before so what happened is a woman's right to work became a woman's obligation to work within the space of about 30 years, really. I think largely driven not really by the need for foreign holidays. I think it was driven by the fact that you can't afford to run a house on one income unless you work for Goldman Sachs. Okay, right. Now, interestingly, beforehand, in those discretionary 40 hours, which it didn't have to be women, it mostly was, no particular reason why, a lot of that time was devoted to maintaining social fabric. It might have been childcare for each other, for example. A lot of it was probably social barter. And churches were indeed a very, very good outlet for people with discretionary time to put it to good use in the community.
Well, my strong impression is that we sometimes hear of a quiet revival going on in British churches, and there's some evidence that a strand of the younger generation, on the whole middle class, probably quite highly educated strand of the younger generation, working very, very hard, as they all have to, do find themselves drawn towards church services. And they are those church services, whether Catholic, Anglican, evangelical, whatever, that do help people reclaim a sense of time and peace and solitude. That, if the churches try to sell that, they might find that they're enormously successful than if they try and sell quick salvation.
I mean, my wife's church did a very interesting experiment. This was not her current church, her previous church did a very interesting experiment where you held a 10-minute service on the hour all day. And one thing I think the churches can experiment with is formats. Now, my wife and I have huge disagreements about this, in the same way that when we shop, I self-scan with a mobile phone and she goes up to the till like it's 1972. And I claim that, physical. I'm wrong here, by the way. I think she's right.
It's 1972, and there is Mr. Humphreys and Mrs. Slocum.
Exactly. But physical co-location may not always be necessary. Obviously you have televangelists in the United States, all manner of things like that. But I do wonder about the experimenting with channels of delivery and formats. Now, I think my wife's probably right and I'm wrong, but my natural advertising urge is to say, you can't necessarily have a service at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday if both parties have been working for 5 days and really need a lie-in.
If the churches had the courage to explore and reclaim their own traditions, they would find a great many more formats available to them than at the moment they're making use of. This has been a fascinating discussion. Rory Sutherland, what a treat to have you on Holy Smoke, and just can't wait till next time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.